children in that regard. Well, also, if you want to resuscitate your body's creative processes, do not forget a cup of Inspire Africa coffee to go a long way in doing you or your body well. Well, let's talk about how COVID-19 pandemic has affected children. Joining forces, a consortium of 6 child rights organizations, including Child Fund, Plan International, Save the Children, SOS Children's Villages, yes, the Tere.om and World Vision has released a report protecting children during the COVID-19 crisis. They're going to be giving us a brief of what is entailed within the report. The report explores the child protection needs that were highlighted during the pandemic, and the assessment which was done in Kampala, Wakiso, Obongi, Gulu, Busia and Bujiri does reveal that there had been a rise in all forms of violence, especially child labor, physical and sexual violence. I think when you had me say that COVID-19 has affected children, you might have been saying, well, COVID-19 doesn't adversely affect them as far as infections are concerned, but other forms of violence have befallen our children, sexual violence and so forth, child labor inclusive. I do have Diana Tibesigwa. She is an advocacy and influencing specialist with Plan International. We are also joined by Jean Akite Lydia, a child protection and advocacy manager with Child Fund. Ladies, thank you for joining me right here on Morning at NTV. Let me start with you, Diana. What's entailed in this report?
Okay, good morning, viewers. Like you have given us a brief about the report being conducted. It was conducted in 6 districts, and like you have highlighted, this is joining forces which brings together the 6 organizations, as you mentioned, Plan International, World Vision, Child Fund, Tere.om, and SOS. So in this report, it's highlighting the impact of COVID-19 on children, and we are actually not saying that violence against children, is just coming up during COVID-19. Further, this report is just affirming some of the issues that were affecting children even before the pandemic, because globally violence against children has been on the rise, and COVID-19 has been a catalyst, in worsening the situation around children. So this assessment that was done in the 6 districts was to help us as organizations to come up with evidence and use it to engage different stakeholders to show the impact and magnitude of COVID-19 and its impact on children. Remember, COVID-19 has been responded to differently. Government has been focusing so much on, vaccine, hand washing, and then the other effects of COVID-19, for example, the increase in violence, have not really been responded to, and part of this report is to actually bring out the findings of what has been happening during the pandemic. So when you look at the report, it's already on the website for joining forces. In Uganda, for example, physical violence, we had different respondents: children, parents, leaders within communities. And the report highlights that around 65.8% of the respondents, and these are children, say that they have at least experienced physical, violence during this pandemic. And the fact that we have these children, in homes, we have had them for a long time. The report also further highlights that 80% of the respondents agree that the children where they live, among caregivers, parents, and then the leaders are failing to respond to the child protection risks within their families. The report also further assessed the child protection systems and mechanisms within communities where these children live. And it highlights that, government has done something, in terms of having structures in communities where these children live. But during this pandemic, these services have actually been limited or hard to access, by these children. And parents and caregivers who would wish to actually get involved in responding to issues that are affecting children. But it has been hard. Remember, in 2020 March, everything was closed. So even when this child faced, let me say, any physical effect, sexual, it was hard to reach, any child protection point for support. So of course with these organizations, the 6 organizations that you have mentioned, World Vision Plan, we had to get involved, you know, to kind of make sure that these points are actually opened up and children are protected, and some of the things that are affecting them are responded to. Yeah.
All right, Jane. I'm going to talk to you about pre-pandemic, what the violence that was meted out against our children before this pandemic. How rife was it?
Oh, before the pandemic.
Before the pandemic, because you mentioned that even before the pandemic, there was violence taking center stage on our children. I was reading reports, and even in the school settings, teachers were taking advantage of their learners, sexually abusing them.
We actually had a national violence against children survey in 2018, which actually also stated the magnitude of violence that children were facing. What we are saying is that it's not that violence wasn't taking place before. We are saying that with COVID, violence actually increased. The stress that parents were going through, the fact the restrictions came up with stress, the restrictions came up with the fact that incomes were lost, sources of income were lost. So parents are within their homes stressed, children are also stressed, the fact that their normal lives have been restricted. Therefore, the parents are actually taking on their children and they're becoming perpetrators of abuse of their own children.
So before the pandemic, what were the push factors? Because right now we know the push factor is the pandemic itself, COVID-19. So before the pandemic, what were the push factors leading to violence against children?
Before the pandemic, I would say they were still the same, but we had structures that were in place. We had the schools. The children were taking up much of their times within schools. The teachers were also participating in monitoring and promoting protection of children within those settings. But the fact that the pandemic came in, the routine of the children was actually put on hold. So they are home. Some of them tell us they are idle. So the fact that you're idle, you have to look for other coping mechanisms. And if you can't get the coping mechanisms within the home, which the home is already stressed enough, the parent is stressed, the child is stressed. So there's a lot of complexities that come with restrictions that came with COVID. So definitely, pre-COVID it was there, but the magnitude has increased. The studies of 2018 show that the magnitude was below 50, but the recent study, this assessment that we are talking about, is actually talking about 65.8%, which is an increment of about 15%. 15% is a great increment when it comes to actually abuse. And if you're looking at the numbers right now, you're looking at teenage pregnancy numbers. The numbers that are coming in are quite high, And
you have 8,000 in Kabale, one area.
As compared to pre-COVID.
All right.
So we at least have a comparison, and we know that it has actually increased, but also the voices of the children clearly tell us what is on ground.
All right, Diana, what effect does violence on children have on them?
Of course, violence takes different forms because we have different forms of violence. Like we mentioned, we're looking at physical violence, we're looking at emotional violence, we are looking at sexual violence. And if you look at all assays, like some of the reports that have been coming in, not just this one, we have been hearing media reports coming out reporting high cases of teenage pregnancies,
female genital mutilation.
Yes, child marriage and all that. It means that if this child gets pregnant, if she's not supported well, by the parents and the community to plow back into the education system, it means we are going to lose that child. She's a child and she's going to give birth to another child. Most of the time they have economic challenges. Some of them are child-headed families, like this report highlights. Some of these children are within the refugee settlements, and they're being raped, they're getting pregnant. As much as there has been support towards this group of people, if during this pandemic they're getting off, through having these forms of violence, it means they're not going to participate and engage engage into the development processes of this country, you know. Then if you look at, for example, emotional and physical violence, most of the time these are things that are hard to notice by people who do them, because traditionally some of the physical acts that we do as parents and caregivers, they are known to be normal, you know. For example, sending a child to work in a mining area, a parent may think that this person is contributing to the income of the family, but you're actually abusing the labor rights of that child. They are below 18. Exactly. We are seeing more children on the streets, and of course in the minds of these parents and caregivers, it's that they're contributing and working to improve the incomes of their families. However, when they are there, you're exposing them to more risks, you know, as children. For example, if it's a girl, there are risks of being raped, defiled, you know, and we don't actually look at all this. But so it is important that we continue to raise awareness around these things, but also it highlights that we need to make sure that policies, you know, and laws that we have around those issues need to be implemented, you know, and tightened, so that we make sure that we protect these children from all those forms of violence.
Jean Lydia, could school closures have contributed to the immense violence meted out on children during this COVID-19 pandemic? And how so?
Yeah, definitely. The school has been seen as a safe, protective environment for children for a long time. Even though
teachers have also been
Yes, even though teachers have been accused, but the teachers have been playing a big role in the protection and promotion of children and ensuring that they are actually protected from violence against children. So with the restrictions and the fact that the school is closed, children are at home, and definitely with that structured way of being in school and guidance is not there within their homes. Parents are also moving out to go and look for a source of income.
Right.
Children are alone in their homes, and some are definitely looking for other coping mechanisms. In the rural areas, we don't have the structured learning that we are doing, online learning, because the children cannot afford that. But they look for other coping mechanisms, moving out of their home, even if the restrictions are there, so that they can be able to engage in other activities. But the activities that they are engaging in are actually destructive behavior. You know, drinking, you know, engaging in early sex, which results into teenage pregnancies, and then you result into, most times result into child marriages. And you've seen increment. Actually, school usually delays children from getting married. Yeah. If they are in school, we are delaying their marriage. And we are delaying teenage pregnancy, and we are delaying that whole process. And you're seeing that you're developing the child through the system, and you have a child that can be able to contribute to economic development at the end of the day. But without the school, definitely there's been some hindrances. And it actually has contributed towards some forms of violence against children.
What about you? Go ahead.
Maybe what I can add on what Lydia is saying, that when children are in school, they prolong, you know, their time of getting pregnant and also getting married. We have some reports already also indicating that 33% of children now who have been in school may never return back to school. And some of the reasons is they are pregnant and their families will not be willing to support them back. Others have actually gone into, you know, economic activities, involved in economic activities, and they may never be actually interested in getting back to what? To school. So as much as some of the things are seen by parents as normal things, on our end we are afraid that we're actually losing part of the population which has to be productive if they go through school and continue and then be able to contribute to the development of this.
Morning at NTV has also noticed that their literacy and numeracy levels have reduced. You have learners within Kumi Alep Tong who can't even count from 1 to 10 anymore. That's how bad it is. Will the continued closure of schools actually make it even worse?
Yes, it is.
Because we are pegging it on the reopening, we are pegging it on the vaccination of the teachers. We've only inoculated 269,000 out of 550,000. And we are not only talking about vaccination of the teachers. If then the learners themselves have to be vaccinated before they go back to school. So tentatively, November and January are only tentative dates. We could be seeing an extension of these reopening dates, even move to July of next year. So in the interim, aren't we, sitting on a time bomb?
Of course, besides the report that we are discussing here, there are so many other assessments that have been done around COVID-19 and learning. And apparently, as much as government is convincing us that children are actually learning through other mechanisms that they have actually talked about, e-learning, providing the reading materials. The recent reports indicate that it's only 51% of children who are somehow involved in learning. So the rest of the children are not actually learning. They're either selling things, they're in families just seated, involved in domestic work. They're not productive in terms of education. And I would not say that this is a problem for parents, When we talk about, for example, learning materials, they have been developed, but we are even failing to print and disseminate them. Besides disseminating, the capacities of parents and caregivers who are in those homes are not in position to support, these children with learning.
Gone to school, their literacy levels are low, so you don't expect them to. They might not be able to actually monitor and support their children through learning.
Even go ahead with continued learning, the internet and so forth.
Yeah, and then they're also not seeing role models. The children themselves are not seeing another role model probably within that community that can help them. So you can see that that cycle of the literacy levels might actually go down in some areas based on the state at which their parents are and probably the people around. But that doesn't stop us from actually, as actors, from working together, trying to encourage parents to ensure that their children are actually learning. And if there are other stakeholders, teachers within, there have been organizations actually supporting teachers to move within their homes to teach and continue, having that guidance, even if the lessons are being taught over radio. If the child doesn't understand, some of the teachers are actually moving into the homes and supporting their children within their homes.
We can't crown this conversation minus talking about children with disabilities. The non-disabled have been grappling, but even those with disabilities have been grappling 10 times. How rife has been the situation during this pandemic? We're talking about continued learning, many of whom come from home states that are poor. They can't even talk about the internet and so forth.
Definitely the situation for children with disabilities is even worse more than the other children, because they already had, they are among the most vulnerable of all the vulnerable children. But definitely issues about learning aids have always been a challenge for children with disability. And as we are prioritizing, most times we don't prioritize these children, but we are also saying that it shouldn't, even if we need to put in as much effort to also support children with disabilities, and we are encouraging both the government and other actors, if you have that, if you can't support, we need to support them and ensure that they also move together with other children, because all children are children, despite we shouldn't discriminate whether they're disabled, whether they are, whether it's a girl or a boy, we all have equal rights.
And when it comes to sexual violence, it was even worse. There's a young child that gave birth twice since the lockdown began in March. We were like, wow, how did it happen? But then when it comes to the reporting, it's hard for them because some have speech problems and so forth. So the reporting of these cases became very, very hard during this COVID-19 pandemic. And also the judicial system. They're asking the victim to present their genital parts in court as evidence. Don't you think that is a deterrent that will stop many of these children or victims of sexual violence from coming out boldly to report their perpetrators?
Definitely during this whole period, the structures themselves were limited, and the report clearly talks about the fact that the structures were you know, it's 80% of the respondents said that the structures were not performing to their fullest.
This is
so,
police.
Yes, police, the LCs, because the restrictions were not
the
only
court.
for us,
Yes.
the court, the restrictions were for everybody. So definitely children had nowhere. If I cannot report to my parent who is already abusive, I cannot even move out of the home to go and report to the others. But what we are also promoting is using other avenues. We have the 116, which is the child helpline, and we've encouraged children and even other adults to report during those lines. And if you actually look at the numbers between October 2020 to even April this year, you could see that there was a rise in the number of calls that the helpline was receiving as a result of promoting alternatives to reporting, because the structures on ground were not functioning to their full capacity.
Their right to health, Lydia Jinakite, was also violated. We're talking about female genital mutilation, and community members were condoning all this and telling these young girls, if you do not get caught, your prospects of getting married off will diminish. If you do not get caught, you'll be excluded from the community. So many of these social misconceptions have taken center stage. Go ahead.
We actually have laws and policies that are there prohibiting female genital mutilation.
Do you think those 10 years are a deterrent?
I think what we need to do is bring back the discussion on table. Bring back the discussion with the cultural leaders, bring back the discussion with faith leaders, opinion leaders within the communities, and let's have the discussion again with them. Are we listening to the children also in these discussions we are having about some of these cultural harmful practices that are being committed on children? The issue is we need to have the dialogue. We have not been dialoguing again. We put the law, but the implementation has been a challenge. So I think those are the things that we need to be discussing and bringing back on table. Are we implementing the law? Are we having the discussions with, are we actually utilizing those influential people? Are we utilizing the cultural leaders? Are we utilizing the faith-based leaders? These are people that have a lot of influence on the community. And if a faith leader or a cultural leader actually speaks up and says, FGM is a bad practice against children, that has to be prohibited, I'm sure that you will have those numbers dwindling, and you will have actually people saying, no, our cultural leader said that shouldn't happen. I think that's the discussion that we are trying to bring, and if you look at the recommendations in this report, they are clearly saying we need to have that discussion again with the cultural leaders.
Diana Timesugwe, what do you think relevant government structures like the courts of law, police and so forth could have done better to protect our children during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, all these structures highlighted as structures of protection, you know, of children. And it is not that they have actually not been working. They have been working to some extent. Reactive,
not proactive.
They have been, they have been responding to some of the issues that have been raised around protection of children. But we have actually been facing challenges. Like Lydia said, during the pandemic, for example, there was a discussion around judiciary on what they're going to be prioritizing during this, you know, pandemic. The fact that some of the limitations were even limiting judges from moving, you know, from their homes to go and serve the country. So some of the cases that were prioritized were not cases of children. You know, they were looking at other cases, meaning that cases around children were put on hold. Yet we needed justice around the abusers, you know, of these children. Then if you go to, for example, police, they are also limited by funding. You get it? So that if, for example, the child helpline refers to a nearby police, you as a family, you have to make sure that you have to actually to invest, because they will tell you they don't have fuel, they don't have money for printing some of those things. If it is a sexual, you know, abuse case, you need to do those confirmatory tests, you know, on defilement or rape, and all those costs actually fall back to this poor to this poor woman or a man. So if police is not ready or in position
to absorb those
all of that, all those cases are going to fall out. And when you talk about government structures, the structures are there, but they are also limited in a way. The report highlights the need to increase funding towards child protection services in Uganda, and these are services that are given by government. For example, if you talk about Ministry of Gender, it's one of the least funded sectors, yet it is a gender machinery which is supposed to actually coordinate, you know, issues of protection around children. But you can imagine in a financial year they receive around 3.8 billion, most of it going into wages. And when it comes to having money for implementation, you know, to support work around protection of children, they are limited. And most funding that comes out is coming from development partners like us, who I will not say that we are sustainable because we are also project-based. So we are there for a short time, but we expect that if government adopts this and increases funding in different points, protection points around children, it is more sustainable. You get it? Yeah.
Diana Tibesigwe, let's also talk about corruption within the various government structures. Do you think corruption within police, the judicial system, has hampered access to justice for many of these victims? You have so many of the perpetrators who have colluded with the police and the judicial system, getting away scot-free in that regard. I report a case, yes, my daughter was raped or defiled, but then later on this perpetrator is out on the streets walking scot-free because he paid off a police officer, because he went to a judge and the judge said, please mediate out of court.
Yeah, the effect of corruption in the system, and especially for children, is you can easily see that when that perpetrator is not, you know, the perpetrator is not arrested and goes back to the community, definitely you will have the perpetrator committing another crime against another child. So definitely you see that if we do not address the aspect of corruption within the system itself, it affects access to justice for children. We need to also address the aspect, talk together with these structures and ensure that we know that children are already vulnerable. Let us not use their vulnerability to actually make them more vulnerable than
Thank you, Jean. It would be callous to end this conversation minus the recommendations in the report in a minute. Dana, we have to go for a short break. What are the recommendations in this report?
One of the recommendations is to continue and strengthen working with faith and community-based organizations to kind of demystify, you know, some of the beliefs and practices that are happening right now within communities. So our continuous engagements with them, since they're within communities, will be helpful in addressing some of the issues that have been highlighted in the report.
Gina Kita-Lydia and also Diana Tibesigwe, many thanks for having made the time to speak to us. It's really, really important that conversations around children are actually held on a daily basis, not just quarterly basis, but daily basis, to assess the impact of this heinous pandemic on our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And of course, you're still watching Morning at NTV. I have